Hello, everyone. I'm John. We're reading Cultural Anthropology, asking questions about humanity. Let's take a look at Table 2.1 in Chapter 2. Theory, Social Evolutionism. All societies pass through stages, from primitive state to complex civilization. Cultural differences are the result of different evolutionary stages. Theory.
Hello there.
Historical particularism. Individual societies develop particular cultural traits and undergo unique processes of change. Cultural traits diffuse from one culture to another. Theory. Functionalism. Cultural practices, beliefs, and institutions fulfill psychological and social needs. Theory. Structural functionalism. Culture is systematic, its pieces working together in a balanced fashion to keep the whole society functioning smoothly. Neo-evolutionism. Cultures evolve from simple to complex by harnessing nature's energy through technology and the influence of particular culture-specific processes. Cultural materialism. The material world, especially economic and ecological conditions, shape people's customs and beliefs. Cognitive anthropology. Culture operates through mental models and logical systems. Structuralism. People make sense of the world through binary oppositions like hot and cold, culture, nature, male, female, and raw, cooked. These binaries are expressed in social institutions and cultural practices like kinship, myth, and language. Interpretive anthropology. Culture is a shared system of meaning. People make sense of their worlds through the use of symbols and symbolic activities like myth and ritual. Post-structuralism. Not a single school of thought, but a set of theoretical positions that rejects the idea that there are underlying structures that explain culture. Embraces the idea that cultural processes are dynamic and that the observer of cultural processes can never see culture completely objectively. Anthropologists call this process of learning the cultural rules and logic of society enculturation. Enculturation happens both explicitly and implicitly. Your student experience illustrates how both explicit and implicit enculturation processes have shaped you. Throughout your schooling, your teachers have explicitly taught you many things you need to know to be a productive member of society, to write, to analyze a text, to do mathematics, and so on. But you have also learned many other things that are more implicit, that is, not clearly expressed. The more implicitly learned lessons in your school years include obedience to authority and respect for social hierarchy. You learned these lessons from sitting in class. In the typical classroom, chairs face forward in rows so the teacher who represents authority can control your attention and movement. Bells and announcements over the loudspeaker also regulate your activities and the flow of your day. By the time you reach the university, these patterns are so ingrained that you take them for granted. But that does not mean enculturation has stopped. It will, in fact, continue throughout your life. You might notice that you are also involved in enculturation, explicit and implicit, as a student at your university, as you learn its specific traditions, which might include creating loyalty to certain mascots and other university symbols. Culture uses symbols. Clifford Geertz. was one of the best-known American anthropologists of recent time. He proposed that culture is a system of symbols, a symbol being something that conventionally stands for something else, through which people make sense out of the world. Symbols may be verbal or nonverbal. Symbols are things that people in a given culture associate with something else, often something intangible such as motherhood, family, God, or country. To illustrate this point, Gertz posed an interesting question. How do we know the difference between a wink and a twitch? As movements of the eye, winks and twitches are identical, but the difference between them is enormous, as anyone who has experienced the embarrassment of taking one for the other can attest. A twitch is an involuntary blink of the eye, and generally speaking, has no symbolic significance. A wink, however, communicates a particular message to a particular someone, and it takes a lot of implicit knowledge first to decode it is a wink or a twitch, and second, to understand what it communicates. In an instant, we must consider a number of questions. Is there intent? What is the intent? Conspiracy, flirtation, parody, ridicule, or something else? Would it be socially appropriate for this person to wink at me, and under what conditions? Underlying are considerations which may barely rise to the surface of consciousness, is a shared system of meaning in which we and the winker participate that helps us communicate with and understand each other. Interestingly, what sounds like a complex computational process, when broken down into these many decisions points, actually come quite naturally to the human mind. This is because of the human capacity for learning with symbols and signs that otherwise have little meaning outside of a given culture. Gert's concept of culture, often called the interpretive theory of culture, is the idea that culture is embodied and transmitted through symbols. This fundamental concept helped anthropologists clarify the symbolic basis of culture, something virtually all anthropologists take for granted today. Because culture is based on symbols, culture is implicit in how people think and act, so they rarely, if ever, recognize culture for what it is. It is simply natural to them. In fact, people express culture in everything they do: playing games, speaking a language, building houses, growing food, making love, raising children, and so on. The meanings of these things and the symbols that underlie those meanings differ from group to group, and as a result, people do things and organize themselves differently around the world. These differing meanings are what make the Balinese, Zapotecs, and Americans. Cultures are dynamic, always adopting and changing. In a globalized world with high levels of migration across cultural borders, communication flowing in all directions, and social and ethnic mixing, it is often impossible to say with any certainty where one culture or social group ends and another begins. As a result, many anthropologists today talk less about culture as a totally coherent and static system of meaning and more about the process through which social meanings are constructed and shared. Attention to cultural processes yields another insight. Culture is dynamic. Social groups are not uniform or homogeneous because not everybody interprets the events of everyday life in the same way, nor do they blindly act out scripts already laid out for them to perform. Cultural processes are emergent, fluid, and marked by creativity, uncertainty, differing individual meaning, and social conflict. Relations of power and inequality often permeate these cultural processes. No social group in the United States is composed of people who are absolutely equal. Despite Americans' insistence that we all have equal opportunity, some people seem to be natural leaders, perhaps because of their charm, intelligence, or wealth. People who are leaders of a group of people, like the most influential students in your dorm, can help others accept burdenism rules or help develop ways to evade them, whereas someone who is less leader or trendsetter will have much less influence in shaping the culture of the same dorm. And university administrators and RAs on dorm floors know that their direct power over student behavior is limited to imposing or enforcing a few rules. But we all know that some RAs can influence their dorm residents better than others, even though everybody knows that colleges and universities have it in their power to expel students for violating basic rules. When conflicts emerge in such settings, those with much less official power may have more influence on the people involved. In the same way, understanding the changing culture of any group requires understanding who is powerful and how they come by this influence. Culture is integrated with daily experience. As cultural beings, how we relate to the world seems natural to us, transparent, obvious, inevitable, and necessary. Our sense of passing time, for example, might contrast sharply with the people in other cultures. This concept, an element of culture, has a critical influence on our daily lives because it helps us organize and regulate our activities every day. It also motivates us to make plans, since the concept of time leads us to believe that time must be used or it will be lost. Our values and beliefs are shaped by many integrated elements of life experience that can be grouped under the term culture. Which foods we eat, the jobs we have, the clothes we wear, how we worship, the way we behave towards others on the street. These and other aspects must work together to keep a culture fully functional. Understanding that culture comprises a dynamic and integrated set of social, economic, and belief structures is a key to understanding how the whole of culture operates. The integration of culture across these domains leads to expectations that are specific to a given social group. For example, white middle-class American parents think it is natural for their babies to sleep in single beds, often in their own rooms. They believe that sleeping with their babies creates emotional dependence. In our society, which prizes personal independence and self-reliance, such as dependence seems damaging to the child. American couples often think of their own bed, the parent's bed, as a place of privacy and sexual intimacy where children do not belong. Other societies find these ideas strange and exotic. The Gusii of Kenya, for example, think it is natural to sleep with their babies, not to mention hold them constantly during waking hours, precisely because they want them to grow up to be dependent on others. For them, proper human behavior means constantly relying on other people. Sleeping also demonstrates that activities you might think of as natural, that is, biologically based, as sleeping is, and therefore universally the same for all humans, are actually cultural patterned. Culture helps shape the basic things all humans must do for biological survival, like eating, sleeping, drinking, defecating, having sex, and so on. There is no better illustration of this fact than food preferences. As omnivores, humans can eat an enormous range of foods, but many Americans' stomachs churn at the thought of eating delicacies like rotten shark flesh, like in Iceland, buffalo penis stew in Thailand, and so forth. No other animal so thoroughly dwells in artificial or human-made worlds of its own creation. Anthropologists stress that a cross-cultural perspective, analyzing a human social phenomenon by comparing that phenomenon in different cultures, is necessary to appreciate just how artificial are our beliefs and actions. A cross-cultural perspective demonstrates the incredible flexibility and plasticity of the human species. Human belief and practices come in all shapes and forms. Culture shapes everybody's life. White middle-class North Americans tend to believe that they have no culture in the same way that most people feel they have no accent. But just as people from Dallas, Boston, or Oklahoma may each feel they have no accent, they will likely feel their culture is not very distinctive either. They will likely feel that they possess the most mainstream aspects of American culture, even though each of the others, not to mention people from Los Angeles, Honolulu, or Seattle, will almost certainly feel that they have a fairly distinctive accent and an equally distinctive culture that varies from mainstream American culture. These are understandable reactions to the transparency and naturalness of culture. But the other side of the coin is the tendency to view minorities, immigrants, and others who differ from white middle-class norms as people with culture. As compared to people who have what they understand as a fairly general American culture in the United States. These ideas are tied to social and institutional power. The more culture, in this sense of the term, one appears to have, the less power one wields. The more power one has, the less one appears to have culture. This power of mainstream culture over ethnic cultures is about the relationship of power and inequality that we mentioned earlier. In fact, by differing from mainstream patterns, a group's culture becomes more visible to everyone. It is in this sense that groups with the most oblivious cultures tend to be the least powerful. Culture is shared. The notion that culture is shared refers to the idea that people, through their participation in social groups, make sense of their worlds and order their lives. Until recently, most anthropologists thought about culture as being transmitted and participated in through face-to-face networks in real communities. But as every student knows, today we can participate in social groups virtually through the internet. Culture is not a product of individual psychology or biology, nor is it reducible to either individual psychology or biology. As a result, anthropologists generally accept that purely psychological and biological explanations of human experience are inadequate. An individual's comprehension of anything is always based on what his or her group defines collectively as proper and improper. Anthropologists commonly refer to such definitions as cultural constructions, which refers to the fact that people collectively build, meaning through common experience and negotiation. In the debate over college mascots, for example, both sides collectively constructed the significance of these images and symbols for both Indians and colleges through their debates, protests, and discussions. A construction derives from the past collective experience in a community, as well as lots of people talking about, thinking about, and acting in response to a common set of goals and problems. Cultural understanding involves overcoming ethnocentrism. One of the key features of culture is that it makes us feel that the way we do things are correct. That is, that we do things as we mentioned in the previous chapter, feeling that everyone else does things the wrong way and that our way of doing things is right is called ethnocentrism. You may think of this process as community-wide form of egocentrism, but for anthropologists who, like all other humans, have a culture, and ethnocentrism presents a major problem. How can we as anthropologists overcome our own ethnocentric biases to view any other culture or group of people objectively? Going and living with a community provides access to understanding what other people do, say, think, and believe. But if we are constantly judging their society and how it does things by our own goals, morals, and understandings, we cannot ever understand them in our own terms. From the beginning of cultural anthropology in America, anthropologists have argued that the only way to understand other cultures is in terms of that other culture's own goals, ideas, assumptions, values, and beliefs. The concept of relativism, by which we interpret and make sense of another culture in terms of the other culture's perspective, using their own goals, values, and beliefs rather than our own to make sense of what people say and do, is a central means of overcoming ethnocentrism and is a major feature of the anthropological perspective on culture. But understanding another culture in its own terms does not mean that anthropologists necessarily accept and defend all the things people do. Even though the job of an anthropologist is not to judge other cultures, but learning to understand how and why other people do things as they do, anthropologists still carry very basic values as individuals and as members of a particular society. A relativistic perspective is simply a useful tool that can help anthropologists overcome ethnocentrism and begin to see matters from the point of view of another culture. A number of anthropologists, in fact, advocate a critical relativism, or taking a stance on a practice or belief only after trying to understand it in its cultural and historical context. Critical relativism also holds that no group of people is homogeneous, so it is impossible to judge an entire culture based on the actions or beliefs of a few. For example, many North Americans practice male circumcision, which other societies consider abhorrent, including people in the German city of Cologne, who banned circumcision in 2012 as a human rights abuse. There is even a small but growing social movement in the United States that condemns the practice along similar lines. But when people from other societies or members of the movement criticize this practice, they are not condemning our entire culture. Similarly, anthropologists can take critical perspectives on particular cultural practices and beliefs without indicating and indicting an entire culture as if it were a homogeneous entity. Another motive for advocating critical relativism is that in an extreme form, cultural relativism can be a difficult position to uphold. It can lead to cultural determinism, the idea that all human actions are the product of culture, which denies the influence of other factors like physical environment and human biology on human behavior. Some critics also argue that extreme relativism can justify atrocities like genocide, human rights abuses, and other horrific things humans do to one another. For some background on the origins of relativism in anthropology, see Classic Contributions, Franz Boas, and the Relativity of Culture. Defining culture in this book. Although all anthropologists agree that these 7 elements of culture are critical to any definition in their research, different anthropologists emphasize or interpret these elements differently, which contributes to the diversity of culture theories expressed in Table 2.1. So while we too accept the importance of these key elements to any definition reflecting our backgrounds as interpretive anthropologists working in regions of rapid social change due to globalization. As authors of this book, we define culture in the following way. Culture consists of the collective process that makes the artificial seem natural. What we mean with this definition is that culture is not a static set of rules or a totally coherent system of symbolic beliefs that people have or carry, like a toolbox, that gets passed down from generation to generation, which have been rather common views of culture among the anthropologists. Culture, in fact, is more dynamic, emergent, and changing than these ideas allow, as culture intermingled due to cross-border interconnections such as migration, global media, economic globalization, and other such dynamics of our contemporary world. So we emphasize culture as the processes, through which people and social groups collectively construct or accept certain ways of thinking and acting such that they feel natural, that is, obvious, appropriate, or even necessary. This definition emphasizes that those feelings of naturalness people experience about their beliefs and actions are in fact artificial. That is, humanly constructed and variable across social groups, and that they can change somewhat quickly. It also assumes that culture is emergent and even unstable, responding to innovation, creativity, and struggles over meaning. The power of this definition is that by presenting culture as a dynamic and emergent process based on social relationships, it leads anthropologists to study the ways cultures are created and recreated constantly in people's lives. Throughout this chapter and in subsequent chapters, we illustrate how this approach to understanding culture works. But this definition does raise an immediate question. If culture is a dynamic process, why doesn't it always feel that way to people? We deal with this question in the next section. If culture is emergent and dynamic, why does it feel so stable? Imagine how chaotic life would be if you could not expect the same rules and processes for interacting with others from one week to the next. People need cultural stability. If we always had to stop and think about changes in the rules of social interactions, we could not function in our society. The very power of culture is that its processes feel totally natural and simultaneously predictable. Yet the previous section defined culture in a way that emphasizes its processes as dynamic and emergent. So how does something feel stable if it is so dynamic? The concept of enculturation, the idea that people have been doing or believing things for much of their lives, only partially explains why culture feels so stable. There are a number of the other features of culture, symbols, values, norms, and traditions that help explain the sense of stability that people feel about it. Symbols. One way of approaching the issue of cultural stability and change is by examining symbols. Leslie White, a prominent American anthropologist, once said, "The symbol is, quote, the origin and basis of human behavior. Human life, in all of its social and material dimensions, is symbolically constituted. A symbol, as we have already said, is something that conventionally stands for something else. The relationship between the symbol and what it refers to is arbitrary, based on no particular rhyme or reason. Symbols can be more than just images or concepts, however. People also use their bodies as symbols. In Japan, for example, bowing is a form of greeting, but depending on how low one bows, it may also symbolize respect, apology, gratitude, sincerity, remorse, superiority, or humility. A society will store its conventional meanings and symbols because their meanings tend to be stable. But symbols and their meanings can and do change, sometimes dramatically. For example, during the Spanish conquest of the Peruvian Andes, during the 16th century, the Spaniards carried banners of their patron saint Santiago, Matamoros, to ensure victory over the Indians. The Indians quickly absorbed Santiago into their native religion. They identified Santiago as their own god of thunder and lightning, Ilapa, who they believe changes forms. To the Indians, Santiago symbolized the power of their own mountain gods and encouraged resistance against the Spaniards. Values. Studying values also helps us to understand how change and stability are so closely related. Values are symbolic expressions of intrinsically desirable principles or qualities. They refer to that which is moral and true for a particular group of people. For example, mom and apple pie symbolize American core values, values that express the most basic qualities central to a culture, such as patriotism or loyalty to country. In the United States, mom expresses the purity of selfless sacrifice for the greater good. Apple pie, a common food since colonial times, expresses American shared heritage. Of course, not everybody eats apple pie, and not every mother is loyal to her family, much less sacrifices herself for the greater good. The point is not that these ideas reflect what actually happens in the real world. Rather, they orient thinking about one's obligations as a citizen, like putting aside differences with other Americans and being willing to sacrifice oneself for love of family and country. Values are conservative in that they conserve prevailing ideas about social relations and morality. Yet, this does not mean that a community's values do not change. Nor does it mean that within a society or community, people will not have opposing values. It is not even uncommon for people to hold conflicting values simultaneously. Norms. While values provide a general orientation for social relations, norms are more closely related to actual behavior. Norms are typical patterns of behavior, often viewed by participants as the rules of how things should be done. In our society, for example, it would be unmanageable to try to haggle over the price of toothpaste at the grocery store because everyone expects you to pay the listed price. But in many other societies, especially in the Arab world and Indonesia, the norm is just the opposite. No matter how small the item, it is considerably rude to not haggle. In such places, taking the first asking price disrespects the seller. For more expensive items, such as a digital camera, buyers and sellers may expect to haggle over the price for an hour. The norm is for the starting price to be 3 to 5 times the item's actual worth. The buyers may break off negotiations and leave the shop 2 or 3 times so the buyer can run after them, bringing them back into the shop with a lower price. Norms are stable because people learn from an early age and because of the social pressure to conform. Norms also tend to be invisible. We're usually not conscious of them until they are broken. As visitors to a different society or even city often find when they do things the wrong way. In Chicago, for example, pedestrians at a stoplight rarely pay much attention to a don't walk light. Many people cross the street whenever they see a break in traffic, but in Seattle, the social norm is different. People wait for the light to change to walk before crossing the street. Even in the rain and even when there is no traffic. When people from Seattle visit Chicago, they are pushed and bumped by other pedestrians rushing to cross the street. When Chicagoans visit Seattle, they tend to cross against the light while Seattleites wait patiently at the corner, scowling at the norm-breaking visitors. The scowl provides a social sanction. a reaction or measure intended to enforce norms and punish their violation. To avoid this public display of disapproval, Chicagoans in Seattle quickly learned to follow the norm. Long-established norms may eventually become customs, which have a codified and law-like aspect. Tradition. Tradition usually refers to the most enduring and ritualized aspects of a culture. People often feel their traditions are very old, which justifies actions that make no logical sense in contemporary times. With such justifications, individuals and groups go to great lengths to protect their traditions. The controversy between Indians and the NCAA schools over mascots with which we open this chapter illustrates how powerful such traditions can be. But anthropologists are careful not to assume that traditions are as old as people may say, because appearances can be deceiving. For example, Scottish people often celebrate their identity with bagpipes and kilts made from tartans, plaid textures that comprise stripes of different widths and colors that identify the wearer's clans. But these traditions, while indeed venerable, are not actually ancient. As a matter of fact, these objects and the sense of distinctive tradition they symbolize emerged only during the 18th and 19th centuries. An English iron industrialist designed the kilt as we know it for his workers in the late 1700s. As the kilt caught on in the Scottish Highlands, textile manufacturers began producing distinctive plaids to expand sales and found willing buyers among the clan chiefs. The chiefs wanted to distinguish themselves and their ancestry as unique, so they adopted particular designs. When England's King George IV made a state visit to Scotland in 1822, the organizers heavily promoted the use of kilts and tartans to enhance the pageantry of the visit. This occasion legitimized Highlands culture and established the look as a national institution. The power of tartans comes not from their antiquity, but from their association with the clans that have long been central to Scottish Highlander social life. Figure 2-5 shows another example drawn from Japanese culture of a similarly recent and flexible tradition. Such examples demonstrate that what we take as timeless and authentic examples of tradition may be quite recent innovations. But knowing that a particular tradition may be a recent invention does not mean people are any less protective of it. Just ask defenders of Indian mascots on college campuses. Most mascots came about only during the early 20th century. Historically, anthropologists have emphasized that culture is shared among a group of people, implying a kind of uniformity and stability in culture. Clearly, people need a relatively stable and common base of information and knowledge in order to live together. But these different aspects of culture, symbols, values, norms, and traditions are features that seem stable and common even though they may not be shared by everybody in a society. There's another reason culture feels stable. It is that culture is expressed through social institutions, a theme we turn to next. Figure 2.5, another tradition that might surprise you. Like the use of tartans in Scotland, sumo wrestling in Japan feels ancient, although key features of it, such as the practice of awarding one-person champion, are less than 100 years old. How is culture expressed through social institutions? The social institutions of any society are the organized sets of social relationships that link individuals to each other in a structured way in a particular society. These organizations of sex and reproduction, raising children, etc., economic activities, farming, herding, manufacturing, and trade, religious institutions, rituals, religious organizations, etc., and political forms for controlling power. Each culture has its norms, values, and traditions for how each of these activities should be organized, and in each case, they can vary greatly from one society to another because each society has a very different culture. Let us consider how mid-20th century anthropologists approach culture's relationship to social institutions. Then we will consider how changes in the institutions can shape cultural patterns, which ultimately transform the social institutions themselves. Culture and social institutions. From the 1920s to the 1960s, the dominant answer to this question about how culture was expressed in social institutions was that culture is like the glue that holds people together in ordered social relationships. Associated with British anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski and A.R. Radcliffe Brown. This theory, known as functionalism, holds that cultural practices and beliefs serve purposes for society, such as explaining how the world works, organizing people into roles so they can get things done, and so on. Functionalists emphasize that social institutions function together in an integrated and balanced fashion to keep the whole society functioning smoothly and to minimize social change. As an illustration of functional analysis, think back to the case of the Ongi, the people who believe their ancestors make earthquakes and tidal waves. The functionalist would focus on how Ongi beliefs about their ancestors explain how the natural world works, and that these beliefs in turn help shape and are shaped by their migratory hunting and gathering existence. Working together with other structures of Ongi society, such as political organization, economics, kinship, and so on, these beliefs contribute to the maintenance of an ordered society. For functionalist, cultures were closed, autonomous systems, but even at its height of popularity, critics insisted that the functionalism vision of culture was too stable. In fact, not all societies function smoothly, and functionalism's static view of culture could not explain history and social change. One of Britain's most prominent anthropologists, E. Evans Pritchard, famously broke with functionalists in 1961 when he said that anthropology should not model itself on the natural sciences but on humanistic disciplines, especially history with its processual focus. In spite of its shortcomings, functionalism has left important legacies, especially that of the holistic perspective, a perspective that aims to identify and understand the whole. That is, the systematic connections between individual cultural beliefs, practices, and social institutions, rather than the individual parts. This does not mean contemporary anthropologists still see a society as wholly integrated and balanced. Rather, the holistic perspective is a methodological tool that helps show the interrelationships among different domains of a society. Domains that include environmental context, history, social and political organization, economics, values, and spiritual life. Thus, the life of a community becomes expressed through the social relationships among its members, organized as they are through their social institutions. To understand how change in cultural values can lead to change in social institutions, consider the relationship between diet, industrialization, and sexual deviance. American culture expressed through breakfast cereals and sexuality. Let us begin by posing a simple question. Why do so many Americans prefer cereal for breakfast? Most of us today prefer cereal because it's part of a healthy and nutritious diet, the standard industry line, or because of its convenience. In any event, eating cereal for breakfast has become a social norm for a majority of Americans. It builds on positive cultural values attributed to health and on the symbolism of healthy food equals a healthy body. But cornflakes began in the 19th century as a cure for sexual deviance, masturbation being the most worrisome. 19th century religious leaders considered masturbation an abomination, and the emerging scientific disciplines of psychiatry and surgery claimed that masturbation caused shyness, hairy palms, jaundice, insanity, cancer, and murderous behaviors. From 1861 to 1932, the U.S. Patent Office issued some 24 patents on anti-masturbation devices to prevent boys from masturbating. Among them, a safety pin to close the foreskin of the penis, various kinds of male chastity belts, and an electric bell attached to the penis that would notify parents if their son got an erection during the night. As recently as 1918, a U.S. government brochure advised new parents to prevent their babies from masturbating by tying their hands and legs to the sides of their cribs. Circumcision became the most commonly performed surgery in the United States based on the view that it prevented masturbation. John Harvey Kellogg, the inventor of cornflakes, was a physician from Battle Creek, Michigan. He was a nutritional enthusiast and a follower of the health food movement of vegetarian and dietary reform Sylvester Graham, who had developed graham flour used in graham crackers. Kellogg became director of a Seventh-day Adventist sanitarium in Battle Creek, where he built on Graham's ideas, inventing cornflakes and various granolas as food for his patients. Both men were concerned with health and sexuality. They especially abhorred masturbation, which they attributed to animalistic passions that were enhanced by a rich, meaty, or spicy diet. Both believed that bland but healthy foods were the way to soothe these volatile and unhealthy sexual urges. Of course, their solution to the perceived problem of sexual passion was based on the symbols of passion being fiery that could be quenched symbolically only with bland cereals. None of these efforts ever prevented masturbation, of course, and no one defends them for that purpose anymore. But these assumptions were enough to create cornflakes and graham crackers. The meanings we give to eating cereal and masturbation have changed as our lifestyles and diets have changed. In fact, an increasing number of medical professionals embrace masturbation as good for mental health. During the 19th century, the American breakfast, like the rest of the diet, was a hearty meal of meat, eggs, fish, biscuits, gravy, jams, and butter. Although farmers worked off the calories in their fields, as America became more urban and rich meals became a sign of prosperity, just as the ideal body type was a full-bodied for both men and women. But as American culture began to value healthy eating early in the 20th century, industrial cereal makers like C.W. Post and Kellogg's brother William took advantage of this connection between cereal and good health to market their creation as nutritious foods. By 1920s, the American diet had shifted dramatically, along with the ideal body type becoming much thinner. The result was an increased demand from consumers for convenient and tasty breakfast cereals, spawning a giant breakfast cereal industry associated with good taste and health rather than with preventing sexual deviance. In answering our initial question, we see interrelationships between separate domains like beliefs about sexual morality, good health, social institutions, and power, expert knowledge, medical practices, and daily life, changes in labor organization and economic life, dietary preferences. This is the holistic perspective. Second, it shows the integration of specific domains. For example, beliefs about sexual morality are intertwined with institutions of social authority, such as sanitariums and medical disciplines like psychiatry and surgery. And those institutions, in turn, regulate people's sexual relationships. Similarly, changes in people's economic relationships and work habits help shape and are shaped by their ideas about what is good to eat. At any historical moment, these domains feel stable because they are reflected in the other domains, even though some may be highly transitory and dynamic. The values, norms, and traditions in one domain are buttressed and supported by values, norms, and traditions in many other domains. And herein lies the power of a cultural analysis. It shows how doing something that feels totally natural, or pouring yourself a bowl of cereal in the morning, is really the product of intertwined artificial processes and meanings. In thinking like an anthropologist, understanding holism, we present a scenario to illustrate how simple innovations can lead to change in social institutions. And I think that's a good point to stop. I think we're doing pretty well, and I will see you next episode. Thanks, everyone.